Welcome to the first episode of Unraveling the Secrets, a new series about unraveling the mysteries of classic games. Everything from regional differences, to finding lost, unused game assets, to covering the controversies of game development and more. This is Unraveling the Secrets, Secret of Mana. There are quite a few differences between the American and Japanese versions of Secret of Mana, starting right from the introduction of the game. As you can see, it's not much from the beginning, just the main logo change and the difference in pace in the text. But the more it goes on, the more differences start to become apparent. The background of both versions seems to be the same image, but the American version is zoomed in much closer. This makes the scale of the image on the Japanese version seem much more grand. The positions of the birds is also different between the versions, the Japanese version seeming much more natural. The story that's told during the introductions is in English on both versions, but the story itself is told in slightly different words. I have to say, I really prefer the original Japanese introduction sequence. It just seems so much larger and more magical. The sense of scale is so much grander and includes so much more of the artwork. I also appreciate that there's less information displayed at the bottom of the Japanese version, simply Square, 1993. The American version nearly covers our heroes with text completely. And before we get into the game itself, let's take a look at its map. The game begins in the land of the Mana Knight, and this encompasses pretty much everything in the beginning of the game from Potos Village to the Grand Forest. Next is the Upper Lands, which includes places like Popoi's homeland Sprite Village, the Wind Palace, and the Cave of the White Dragon. Then we have Kakara Desert with the town of Kakara and the Fire Palace. And then the Ice World with the Ice Palace and Santa's house. And finally, the Empire, home of the Imperial Palace. Next, let's take a look at some of the graphics changes between the Japanese and American versions, like the Warp Portal. The Kettlekin boss, which lost his chainsaw and got hammers. The Earthslide magic icon, which we know is a ball that explodes, but in the Japanese version is a catfish that either smiles or frowns. And of course, the introduction scene. Now, there's something weird about the Japanese introduction scene if you disable the sprite layer that has the logo. It has a really small out-of-focus area that more fits Maru Island than it does the original Japanese image. Is this something left over from the original PlayStation development? So why was the original Maru Island abandoned, and the original PlayStation development between Nintendo and Sony? Well, it's a long story that includes a lot of betrayal. The beginning of Secret of Mana begins with a failed deal between Sony and Nintendo, which was the first PlayStation. Nintendo wanted a disc-based system to compete with Sega. Sony wanted to enter the video game market, and they thought it was the perfect idea. Sony would provide the discs, Nintendo would provide the other hardware, and they would both make money. Sony announced the PlayStation at CES in 1991, and then the next day, Nintendo said they had no idea what Sony was talking about and that they were developing the system themselves with Philips. Oh. Well, that didn't stop Sony, and they still released the PlayStation, still using their own discs, and Nintendo had to fall right back to the Super Nintendo, losing every idea that they had for the next few years. And Nintendo's betrayals don't stop there. Maru Island, which was Secret of Mana and Chrono Trigger wasn't the only game being developed for the Nintendo PlayStation. Final Fantasy VII was also actively being developed for the Nintendo PlayStation. That's one of the most famous Sony PlayStation games ever released. It obviously went to the Sony PlayStation because they had CDs, which offered way more storage space so they could tell their entire story. And once Square brought the Final Fantasy series to PlayStation, they were dead to Nintendo, and Nintendo let them know it. And just like that, Nintendo burned 2 bridges. Now let's take a look at some of that cut content. The bare arm, body, and head positions in the wheel menu. I'm not sure why they would not have used these, but they're unavailable. The ruby armlet, a white sprite animation, and a max candy item. The max candy item would have been great. Then an unknown item with a sprite and a question mark with no other information. There were a lot of different random sprite animations that weren't used in the actual game but were found on the cartridge. I can only imagine the amount of storyline changes and translation changes that would have come in like pairs of scissors, like Edward Scissorhands at this game. So it's not surprising that even in the cartridge itself we ended up with so many random things that weren't used. I can only imagine how much is actually available in the original development plan, where they were planning for a 600 megabyte disc instead of a 6 megabyte cartridge. There's even an unused character. Now let's take a look at things that you can access within the game. One of the most famous Easter eggs in Secret of Mana is the NOS code. Hold L and A and press R 39 times, then R one more time, and you'll see NAS for every character in the game. There's also a seemingly random change to the moon scene at the end of the game, sometimes being a full moon, sometimes not, and also sometimes having different positions of shooting stars or not. If you have an action replay or are emulating the game, you can enter codes to see the development room. You can't do much in here, but it is pretty cool. The final boss, Thanatos, is based on the Greek god, which is the personification of death. He is the quiet bringer of death, ensuring people die when the fates decree. Undyne, the water elemental, is based on 15th century European stories of Undines, water spirits that were magical beings not bearing souls like humans. One popular fan theory is Randy is Chrono, since they're both based on one source game that was older and split into 2. It's a common theory that Chrono and Randy are the same character, just written for 2 different parts of one story. There are 2 hidden faces across the map that you can only see whenever you're flying. The use of them is unknown, but they are really interesting if you randomly come across them. If you stop and look at the mystical book enemies long enough, they'll turn into this image. Shadow Zero is an enemy that is almost impossible to come across normally in the game, usually only appearing through chest drops. If you hit the totems in the forest in the upper land, their tongues will stick out and go back in. There is actually a complete book of secrets that includes everything you could ever need to know or want to find in that game. Next, I'd like to cover some strategies that are really effective for new players, because there's a couple of areas in this game in the beginning that are like solid walls if you're going the wrong way. I know when I first played this game, I ended up in the haunted forest early, and these two wolves made my life a nightmare because I thought that this is the only way that you could unlock this next character. But you walk in and just get pounded to death. It's because you're not actually supposed to be there if you only have one character. You need to go to the dwarf village. There's actually a boss you missed, and you pick up Popoi. That also explains why it feels like you're underleveled for the situation, is because you are. I know it took me several playthroughs before I realized that I was supposed to not only go to the dwarf village, but where it was. But once you do, you can grind through this, and you can get them both. But it's so much easier with both characters. If you end up there with one character, go back, pick up Popoi. The spiky tiger is like maybe the hardest part of the entire game. And it's because up to this point you've only been using physical weapons. And for this fight you can only use physical weapons. But right soon after this, your party's going to learn magic. And they will be able to use that for the rest of the game. So I died hundreds of times on this boss until I realized that there's just one strategy. You have to keep moving and utilize long-range weapons when he's up on those platforms. If you stand still while he's on that platform, you'll just get burned endlessly, and you won't even be able to use healing items fast enough. You need to just constantly switch to a long-range item, hit him while he's up there constantly until he jumps down. And then once he's down, strike him and then run. You have to move around or he will just lock you in position and pound you out. Again, he jumps on top of the platforms, switch items, long range, hit him, hit him, hit him. He's still going to get hits in, but he's not going to lock you down and dominate you over and over. Always remember that you can switch to other characters with the select button and use healing items in between. And you're going to need them because this is going to be a really, really long battle. It doesn't really seem to matter if you're over leveled or not. There isn't really an over leveled for this situation. It's not ever going to be like a 30-second fight. I think this takes me like 5 minutes most of the time. So just remember, it's going to be about 5 minutes of just constant running around, big heavy hits when he's on the ground, and when he jumps up onto those platforms, switch items to your long range, hit him again. And eventually, after minutes, he will be defeated. In this last section, I want to show the differences between all of the pages between the American and Japanese manuals. And on top of that, just discuss the game that we got. It's really interesting to think that The Secret of Mana and Chrono Trigger were both built out of a story that was split in two. And that it was for a system that never existed between two companies that we think of now as video game competitors. I always thought that Square just quit releasing things for Nintendo just because they stuck to cartridge for so long, and I never really understood that Square kind of had a hand in the making of PlayStation as well, because they were the first major developer to bring an RPG to the PlayStation in such a major way. And how could Nintendo expect them not to? It was Nintendo's fault in the first place that Square had to rewrite their original vision multiple times. And it was their fault that they had to take Final Fantasy VII and completely redevelop it. I can only imagine the hundreds of hours that were deemed completely pointless the moment that Nintendo said publicly it was not working with Sony. It's really no wonder that Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VII are such amazing games, because Chrono Trigger is based on Maru Island, and it had more time to develop. It released 2 years after Secret of Mana did, and it was based on the same story and arguably the same characters, with mechanics that weren't used in the original game. Let alone Final Fantasy VII getting reworked to the Nintendo 64 and then getting reworked again to the PlayStation. Reworking the same idea is gonna make it better every single time. So what we lost in Secret of Mana, we gained back in Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VII.